The cold metal chair creaked as Velta shifted her weight, her silver scales catching the harsh light of the interview room. 23 years had passed since the war. But her hands still shook when she thought about those days. The tremor was worse now, a constant reminder of what she had witnessed on the battlefield dot across the small table. The young Galactic War Archives representative fumbled with his recording device. His name was Kixmore, and he looked barely old enough to have lived through the war, let alone document it. His eager expression reminded Velta of the soldiers she once knew, the ones who thought they understood combat before they had seen it up close. The device is working now, Kixmore said, his voice carrying the professional tone of someone who had conducted many interviews. Please state your name and service record for the archives. Velta's throat felt dry. She had avoided this moment for decades, turning down every request for an interview. But something about the young archivist's persistence had worn her down. Maybe it was time. Maybe the galaxy needed to hear what really happened during the Terran integration wars. My name is Velta Shixanara, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I served as a communications officer in the 3rd Zephyrian Regiment during the Kepler Offensive. I was stationed at Firebase Omega for 6 months, working alongside human forces. Kixmore made notes on his tablet, nodding encouragingly. The records show that Firebase Omega was a joint operation between multiple species. What made you decide to speak about your experiences now? Velta's laugh was bitter and short. Because people are forgetting. The politicians, the diplomats, the civilians, they all think they know what humans are like. They see them at peace conferences, shaking hands and signing treaties. They think humans are just another species in the Alliance. Her silver eyes grew distant, focusing on something beyond the interview room walls. But I remember what they were like when the dying started. I remember what they became when civilization fell away. The young archivist leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. The official reports describe the human military as highly effective, but within normal parameters for galactic warfare standards. Are you suggesting something different? Normal parameters, Velta repeated, her voice taking on hollow quality. You want to know about normal parameters? I watched a human soldier take a plasma bolt to the chest and keep fighting for 3 hours. I saw another one lose both arms and still manage to complete his mission using his teeth to pull grenade pie. Kixmore's writing stopped. His young face had gone pale, the confident expression replaced by something closer to confusion. Surely you're speaking metaphorically. No species can survive those types of injuries. That's exactly what I thought, Velta said, her hands clenching. Into fists, every species in the galaxy has limits. We all have a breaking point where survival instincts take over. We retreat. We surrender. We preserve what we can. But humans, she shook her head slowly. Humans don't have a breaking point. They have a starting point. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the recording device. Kixmore seemed to be struggling with how to respond. Finally, he cleared his throat and tried again. Can you tell me about your first encounter with human forces? What was your initial impression? Velta closed her eyes, and suddenly she was back on Arcturus Prime, standing in the makeshift briefing room with its cracked walls and flickering lights. She could smell the ozone from the plasma burns and hear the distant rumble of artillery. It was supposed to be a standard assignment. She said, our regiment was tasked with providing communication support for a joint assault on a hegemony position. The humans had requested backup, which made sense. The enemy had superior numbers and better fortifications. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Kixmore. I expected to meet soldiers who were grateful for our help. Professional warriors understood the value of combined tactics and careful planning. Instead, I met Sergeant Hahn. What was different about him? Everything, Velta said without hesitation. He was shorter than most humans, maybe 5.5 feet tall, quiet, polite. Always said please and thank you. He looked like he should have been teaching children or working in a library. But his eyes, she paused, searching for the right words. His eyes were completely empty. Not cold or angry or determined, just empty, like he had already decided. He was dead. Kicksmore was writing frantically now, trying to capture every detail. Did he explain their tactical approach? Oh, he explained it, Velta said, her voice taking on a bitter edge. The plan was simple. They were going to charge directly through the enemy bombardment zone, absorb whatever damage they had to, and take the position through close combat. When our commanding officer asked about casualty projections, Hein just shrugged and said they expected total losses. 100% casualties, Velta clarified. They were planning to die, all of them, and they were fine with it. The recording device continued its quiet humming, capturing every word of a story that would challenge everything the galaxy thought it knew about their human allies. Velta's voice grew steadier as SH. He continued her story, though her hands still trembled slightly. The young archivist waited patiently, his recording device capturing every word. The first time I saw Sergeant Hyun's unit, they were sitting round a small fire, sharing what looked like regular food rations. There was Corporal Min, a woman, with short black hair and a scar across her left cheek. She was cleaning her rifle with the same care most people use to handle newborn children. Next to her sat Jay, their medic, who was quietly organizing his supplies into neat rows. Velta paused, remembering the scene. Private Day was the youngest, maybe 20 standard years old. He was sharpening a knife on a small stone, the metal, making soft scraping sounds in the quiet evening air. They all looked so normal, so human in the most ordinary way. Kicksmore looked up from his notes. What changed your perception of them? The briefing. Velta said immediately. Our command staff had set up a holographic display showing the enemy position. Standard fortress design, built into a mountain, faced with overlapping fields of fire. The approach was across open ground for 2 kilometers, with no cover except scattered rocks. She shifted in her chair, the metal creaking again. Colonel Vexan, our commanding officer, began explaining. The traditional approach. We would use artillery to soften the position, then advance in coordinated waves with air support. Standard procedure that had worked for centuries, and the humans disagreed. Sergeant Hyan raised his hand politely. Velta continued. When the colonel acknowledged him, Hyan stood up and pointed at the hologram. Sir, we appreciate the tactical analysis, but we have a different approach in mind. Then he outlined their plan. Velta's voice took on a tone of disbelief, even after all these years. They wanted to run straight across the open ground. No artillery preparation, no air support, no coordination with other units, just for humans with personal weapons, charging directly into enemy fire. Kicksmore stopped writing and stared at her. That sounds like suicide. That's exactly what Colonel Vexian said, Velta replied. He explained that such an approach would result in immediate casualties. Probably total loss of personnel, Hein nodded and said that was acceptable. Acceptable. Like he was discussing the weather, she leaned forward, her silver eyes intense. But then Corporal Min spoke up. She said their armor could handle the initial bombardment long enough to close the distance. When the colonel asked what kind of armor they were wearing, she pointed to her chest. Standard fabric uniform with ceramic plates. Nothing more advanced than what a security guard might wear. How did they expect to survive enemy fire with such basic protection? They didn't. Velta said flatly, that was the point I couldn't understand. They weren't planning to survive. They were planning to accomplish their mission before dying. The survival part was optional. She rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar headache that came with these memories. I watched them prepare for the assault. Jay, the medic, was filling syringes with stimulants. When I asked him about the dosage, he showed me the labels. Each injection contained enough combat drugs to keep a Zephyrian soldier awake for a week. Jay was planning to use 3 of them, 3 doses. He explained that the first would keep him alert, the second would block pain, and the third would prevent him from falling unconscious even if mortally wounded. I asked what the side effects were, and he said it didn't matter because he wouldn't live long enough to experience them. Velta's hands clenched into fists. Private Day was even worse. He was packing extra ammunition, but not in his equipment pouches. He was taping magazines to his arms and legs, turning himself into a walking arsenal when a round penetrated his body. He wanted to make sure it would hit ammunition and cause an explosion. He wanted to turn himself into a bomb. Not exactly, Velta corrected. He wanted to make sure that if he was going to die anyway, his death would damage as many enemies as possible. Every human carried enough explosives to level a small building. They called it contingency planning. The interview room fell silent. For a moment, Kicksmore seemed to be struggling with the information, his young face showing confusion and disbelief. But surely their commanding officers tried to stop such reckless tactics. Velta Eslaf was bitter. Sergeant Hyan was the commanding officer. This was official human military doctrine, while we were calculating optimal approach angles and casualty ratios. They were recording final messages for their families and dividing up their personal belongings. She stood up and walked to the small window, looking out at the peaceful space station corridor. I remember asking Hyan why they were so willing to die. He looked at me with those empty eyes and said something I'll never forget. We are not willing to die, Velta. We're willing to win. Death is just what happens when you refuse to give up. That's when I realized we weren't fighting alongside soldiers. We were fighting alongside something the galaxy had never seen before. The memory hit Velta like a physical blow, and she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. Her breathing became shallow as she transported herself back to that terrible day on Arcturus Prime. The assault began at first light. She said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was in the command bunker, monitoring communications. Through the observation window, I could see the enemy fortress carved into the mountainside. Their weapons were already tracking movement across the approach zone. Kicksmore leaned forward, sensing the intensity of what was coming. What happened? When the attack started, Colonel Vexan gave the order to advance. Our forces moved to their positions, ready to provide covering fire for what we assumed would be a coordinated assault. But the humans didn't wait for coordination. Velta's hands trembled as she continued. Sergeant Hines simply stood up, checked his weapon, and started walking toward the enemy position. She paused, reliving the moment. Not running, not charging, just walking, like he was going to the market. Corporal Min, Jay, and Private Day followed him. For humans walking across 2 kilometers of open ground toward a fortress filled with enemies. What was the enemy response? Immediate and overwhelming, Velta replied. Every weapon in that fortress opened fire at once. Plasma bolts, particle beams, explosive shells, energy weapons I couldn't even identify. The bombardment was so intense it turned the air itself into a glowing storm of destruction. Her voice cracked slightly. I watched through the observation scope, expecting to see 4 bodies hit the ground. Instead, I saw something that still haunts my dreams. The humans kept walking. Not dodging. Not seeking cover. Just walking straight through fire that should have vaporized them instantly. Kicksmore's pen had stopped moving. How is that possible? Private. They took the first direct hit. Velta continued, ignoring the question. A plasma bolt meant for vehicle arm struck him in the chest. The blast tore a hole through his torso big enough to put my fist through. He stumbled, looked down at the wound, and kept walking. She stood up abruptly, pacing to the window again. I called out his vital signs to the command center. No heartbeat. Massive blood loss. Organs destroyed. By every medical standard in the galaxy, Private Day was dead. But he was still moving, still fighting, still advancing toward the enemy. What about the others? Corporal Min lost her left. Arm to shrapnel 30 seconds later. A shell fragment severed it completely at the shoulder. She picked up the arm, tucked it into her belt like a spare piece of equipment, and switched her rifle to single-handed operation. The bleeding should have killed her in minutes, but she sealed the wound with something from her kit and continued the assault. Velta returned to her chair, but couldn't sit still. Jay, the medic, collapsed from blood loss after taking multiple hits. I thought he was finally down. But then I saw him crawling across the ground, dragging himself toward the enemy bunker. He was using his medical supplies to create improvised explosives, turning his life-saving equipment into weapons. The young archivist had gone pale, and Sergeant Hine was the worst of all. Velta said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. He was laughing. Actually laughing as enemy fire tore pieces from his body. A particle beam cut through his leg, nearly severing it. He used his rifle as a crutch and kept advancing. When shrapnel destroyed his left eye, he wiped the blood away and adjusted his aim. She sat down heavily, the memory overwhelming her, but the sound of his laughter over the communication channel, it wasn't human laughter. It was something else entirely. Something that made every alien soldier in our command bunker step back from their equipment. How long did this continue? 18 hours. Velta said flatly. 18 hours of watching. Humans refused to die. They took damage that would kill any other species instantly. But they kept fighting. When they ran out of ammunition, they used their knives. When the knives broke, they used their bare hands. When their hands were destroyed, they used their teeth. She looked directly at Kicksmore, her silver eyes reflecting a pain that hadn't faded in decades. I watched Private Day reach the enemy bunker with no functioning organs left in his body. He was running on pure stimulants and willpower. He pulled the pins on his remaining grenades with his teeth and walked into the fortified position. The explosion cleared an entire section of the enemy line. When the smoke cleared, we found him sitting in the enemy commander's chair, still, holding his knife, still trying to fight. He had been clinically dead for over an hour, but his body had never stopped moving. The interview room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the recording device. Kicksmore stared at his notes, clearly struggling to process what he was hearing. The human assault lasted from dawn until the following midnight. Velta continued. By the end, they had taken the entire fortress complex. Not one human survived the assault, but they had accomplished something that should have required an entire division. How did the other species react? We were terrified, Velta admitted. Not of the enemy, of our allies. Velta's breathing became labored as she reached the most difficult part of her story. Her silver scales seemed to lose their luster under the harsh interview room lights, and she gripped the edge of the table with both hands. The final phase began when Sergeant Hine fell, she said, her voice barely audible, After 18 hours of continuous combat, his body finally gave out. But even then, it wasn't over. Kixmore had stopped taking notes entirely, his young face frozen in horrified fascination. "What do you mean it wasn't over?" Hyan had been fighting for the last 6 hours with what our medical scanners later confirmed was a completely severed spinal cord, Velta explained. He couldn't feel anything below his chest, but somehow he kept moving. When he finally collapsed, I thought we would see the end of the nightmare. She closed her eyes, reliving the moment. Instead, Hyan activated something he called a contingency protocol. His armor began broadcasting false tactical frequencies, jamming enemy communications across the entire battlefield. He turned his dying body into a weapon that helped our forces coordinate their final assault. How is that possible? Human military doctrine includes procedures for what they call posthumous combat effectiveness, Velta said, opening her eyes to stare at the young archivist. Every human soldier carries equipment designed to be useful even after death. Their armor doesn't just protect them while alive. It continues fighting after they fall. She stood up and began pacing again, unable to remain still. But Corporal Min was even worse. She had lost both legs to an explosive blast and most of her blood to various wounds. Any rational being would have died quietly. Instead, she began crawling toward the enemy command center, using her arms to drag herself across 200 meters of broken ground. Leaving a trail of blood behind her, I watched through the surveillance feeds as she pulled herself over rocks and through debris. It took her 3 hours to reach the command bunker, and she was singing the entire time. Velta's voice cracked. Some human war song about going home, her voice got weaker as she lost more blood, but she never stopped singing. When she finally reached the enemy position, she used her remaining explosives to collapse the entire structure. The blast was so powerful it shattered windows in our command center 3 kilometers away. What about the medic? Jay had been shot so many times his uniform was more whole than fabric. Velta continued. He should have died from blood loss within the first hour, but he kept injecting himself with combat stimulants, forcing his body to continue functioning past all biological limits. She returned to her chair but remained on the edge, ready to jump up again. I watched him perform field surgery on himself, sealing wounds with medical adhesive while still under enemy fire. When he ran out of medical supplies, he began using parts of his own equipment to create makeshift bandages. How long did he survive? 14 hours after taking mortal wounds, Velta said flatly. He spent his final hour crawling from position to position, treating wounded enemy soldiers, even while dying. He couldn't stop being a medic. But here's what made it truly terrifying. He was treating the enemy wounded so they would survive long enough to be interrogated. Kixmore's hands had begun to shake as he tried to process the information in private Day. Velta's expression darkened. Day was the youngest, but he was also the most frightening. After the explosion that should have killed him, he somehow survived long enough to reach the enemy commander's personal quarters. We found him there 12 hours later, still sitting in the commander's chair, still alive. That's the question that still haunts me. Velta admitted, according to our medical scanners, Day had been clinically dead for hours. No heartbeat, no brain activity, no vital signs of any kind. But his body was still moving, still fighting, still trying to complete his mission. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. He had carved his unit number into the enemy commander's desk using his combat knife. When we found him, his hand was still gripping the weapon, still trying to carve more letters. His body had refused to stop fighting even after death. What did your medical teams make of this? They couldn't explain it, Velda said. The human soldiers had sustained injuries that should have been instantly fatal. Multiple organ failure, massive blood loss, severed spinal cords, destroyed nervous systems. By every medical standard in the galaxy, they should have died within minutes. She stood up and walked to the window again, staring out at the peaceful corridor. But they fought for 18 hours. 18 hours of combat effectiveness while technically dead. Our doctors called it impossible. The humans called it Tuesday. What do you mean? When the reinforcements finally arrived, they brought human medical personnel. Vilter explained. I asked their chief medic how such a thing was possible. He looked at me like I had asked why water is wet. Standard combat performance. He said, nothing unusual about it. The interview room fell silent except for the quiet hum of machinery. Kixmore stared at his unused notepad, clearly struggling to believe what he was hearing. That's when I realized the truth, Velter said softly. We hadn't witnessed human soldiers at their limit. We had witnessed human soldiers performing normally. Velter turned away from the window and looked directly at Kixmore for the first time during the entire interview. Her silver eyes held a weight that seemed to press down on everything in the room. The young archivist had stopped pretending to take notes, his hands folded in his lap as he waited for her to continue. The war ended 6 months after the Arcturus Prime assault. Velter began, her voice steadier now that she was approaching the end of her story. The hegemony surrendered unconditionally after word spread about what human forces could accomplish, not because of superior technology or better strategies, but because they realized humans had no concept of acceptable losses. She returned to her chair, sitting down slowly like an old woman despite being only middle-aged by Zephyrian standards. Every battle where humans participated ended the same way. Complete victory at costs that should have been impossible to sustain. The enemy would calculate their odds, realize they were fighting beings who treated death as a minor inconvenience, and surrender rather than face annihilation. Kixmore finally found his voice. But surely the human military command recognized the unsustainable nature of such tactics. That's what I thought, too, Velter replied, after Arcturus Prime. I requested a meeting with the human commanding officer, General Park. I wanted to understand how they could justify such losses, how they could send soldiers into situations with zero survival probability. She paused, remembering the conversation. General Park was a small woman, maybe 50 years old, with graying hair and kind eyes. She looked like someone's grandmother. When I asked her about the casualty rates, she smiled and offered me tea. What did she say? She said that humans don't calculate victory the same way other species do. Velter continued. Other species fight to minimize losses while achieving objectives. Humans fight to achieve objectives regardless of losses. The difference seems small, but it changes everything. Velter's hands clenched into fists on the table. I asked her how she could send soldiers like Hein and his unit into certain death. She looked confused by the question. I didn't send them to die, she said. I sent them to win. What happened to them individually was less important than what they accomplished collectively. Did that explanation satisfy you? It terrified me, Velter admitted, because I realized she wasn't being cruel or calculating. She genuinely believed that individual human lives were less valuable than mission success. Not because she didn't care about her soldiers, but because that's how humans are trained to think from birth. She stood up again, unable to remain seated. I spent the remaining months of the war studying human culture, trying to understand how an entire species could develop such attitudes toward death and sacrifice. What I learned changed my understanding of everything. What did you discover? Human children play games that would be considered military training by other species, Velta explained. They compete in activities designed to cause pain and injury. They celebrate stories about individuals who died for their communities. Their entire cultural framework treats personal sacrifice as the highest virtue. She walked to the door, then turned back to face Kixmore. But here's what really frightened me. The war ended 23 years ago, and since then, humans have been model citizens of the Galactic Alliance. They build hospitals, teach in schools, serve on diplomatic missions. They're peaceful, friendly, helpful neighbors. That sounds positive. It would be, if I could forget what I saw on Octa's Prime. Velta said, every time I see a human diplomat shaking hands at a peace conference. I remember Sergeant Hein laughing while enemy fire tore him apart. Every time I see a human teacher playing with alien children, I remember Private Day sitting dead in that command chair, still trying to complete his mission. She leaned against the door, suddenly looking exhausted. The humans who ended the war didn't disappear. They went home, got jobs, raised families, became productive members of society. But they're still the same species that treats death as an acceptable tactical option. Do you think they pose a threat to the Alliance? I think they pose a threat to the universe, Velta said quietly, not because they want to conquer or destroy, but because they're capable of things that break the fundamental rules of how intelligent life behaves. Every species has survival instincts that prevent them from choosing certain death. Humans have override switches. She opened the door, then paused. I've watched the news feeds for 23 years, waiting for some crisis that would require humans to stop being civilized. Every time there's a natural disaster or terrorist attack, I hold my breath and wait to see if they'll revert to what they really are. What do you think would happen? Velta looked back at the young archivist one final time. I think the galaxy would remember why we were so grateful when the war ended. Not because the fighting stopped, but because the humans agreed to stop fighting. She stepped into the corridor, then spoke over her shoulder. Pray to whatever gods you believe in that humanity never decides the current peace is insufficient. Because the universe isn't ready for what they become when they stop pretending to be like the rest of us. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss, leaving Kixmore alone with the recording device and a story that would haunt him for the rest of his life.